Welcome to the next AP World History video lesson that covers the CCOT essay. In this particular lesson, I've also provided an example that I wrote for you guys. That way you could see how evidence and analysis should be written for this particular essay of the AP exam. Hopefully you will find this information helpful. All right, let's get down to it. The CCOT essay that this covers is the one that we went over in class, analyzing changes in continuities in labor systems and the global system from 1450 to 1750. And the first thing that you need to do is hopefully you have your copy of the prompt sheet in your essay with you. The first thing that you need to do is determine if you understand what the question is asking. I think in the past, in some of our earlier essays, there's been a disconnect between the prompt and you guys. In other words, not everyone has been able to understand what the question is asking you to write about. And I think that's part of the problem. And I should have said this on Tuesday when I explained that we're just kind of going to be done with that first round of CCOT essays. What I should have done was explain to you guys that your essays weren't bad. A lot of them actually were pretty well written. You just didn't write about the right thing, the right topics. Some of you wrote about religion, some of you wrote about labor systems, but you wrote about labor systems after 1750 or before 1450, so I believe that's where part of the disconnect is. You need to make sure you understand what the question is asking. And this particular question wants you to analyze the changes in continuities in systems that organized how people work, that's a labor system, during a period of tremendous global interaction, 1450 to 1750. And it's an open-ended question, which means that you could focus on whatever region or regions you know best. So now it's possible that you'll be given a choice of 3 and you need to choose one location, but it's also possible that you could get an open-ended question like this where you get to write about the one you know best. Okay, so we talked about labor systems and changes in continuities, and we came up with slavery, agriculture, and craft work, or traditional native work, as 3 possible answers for continuities. And our changes were the expansion of slavery into the New World, the number of people that began to work in small-scale manufacturing increased, and the introduction of new forced labor systems like encomienda, hacienda, and repartimiento that the Spanish implemented in the American colonies. Okay, so I chose 4 answers of those 6. I chose 4 answers to write about. And of course, your first paragraph should be your introduction and your thesis. The continuities and changes in labor systems between 1450 and 1750 had a remarkable impact on the global system. During the period from 1450 to 1750, slavery, that's our first answer, continued, right, it's a continuity, to be an important system of labor. The institution of slavery, however, expanded dramatically across the Atlantic Ocean as African slaves were brought over to the New World. So here is our second answer. The expansion of slavery to the New World. While slaves mainly worked in agriculture during this period, it's our third answer, there was an increasing number of Europeans who found work as small-scale manufacturers. And that is the fourth answer. So and of course when you're writing the CCOT essay, you need to definitely verbatim restate the prompt in your answer. And that's the first thing that I've done here. right? The continuities and changes in the labor systems between 1450 and 1750 had a remarkable impact on the global system. There's the restating of the prompt. And then the next 3 sentences are 4 answers. And this is my thesis. Okay? All of that together is the thesis. Now, included in the same paragraph, you want to address all parts of the question, which means you need to explain at least one continuity and one change, and how it fits into that category. And so, right off the bat, slavery, that's our first answer, had existed long before 1450 and lasted long after 1750. So there you go. That explains slavery as a continuity. It lasted much longer than that 300-year time period. As more people participated in the global economic system, the powerful elites continued to establish forced labor systems. Soon after Europeans created colonies in the Americas, they brought over slaves from Africa to work in the plantation fields. In order to purchase slaves, Europeans traded their manufactured firearms and gunpowder that was in high demand in Africa. And so here, I've taken the next 3 answers and shown you an example of how to address all parts of that question with those answers. So I had the first one there. And then as more people participated in the global economic system, the powerful elites continued to establish forced labor systems. So not only is slavery exist in other parts of the world, but as they bring them over to the Americas and more people are now becoming involved in that global economic system, in particular we're talking now here about Europeans, those powerful elites continued to establish new forced labor systems, even upon the discovery of new lands. Alright, the third answer, agriculture. Soon after Europeans created colonies in the Americas, they brought over slaves from Africa to work in the plantation fields. And you should notice here that I'm focusing around a central theme here with slavery and the work that they did with slavery. Of course, I know small-scale manufacturing, that's different, but and that's the real point with the CCOT essay is there's a main theme, a connection that you have to make within your writing. Okay, brought over slaves from Africa to work in plantation fields. That, of course, indicates agriculture. Now, in order to purchase slaves, Europeans traded their manufactured firearms and gunpowder that was in high demand in Africa. So that then in turn explains how an increased number of people began to work as small-scale manufacturers. Okay, your second paragraph is the start of evidence and context for your first answer. Now, what I want you to do is just right now focus on this part. You don't need to focus on historical evidence because I'll explain that in a second. Let's just worry about the evidence first. It's a real good rule of thumb to give at least 3 pieces of evidence for each of your answers. If it turns out that one answer gets 5 pieces of evidence and another one gets 2, that's okay. But for yourself to make sure that you do have enough and you come up with 3 or 4 answers, you've got 3 pieces of evidence for each, then you know you're going to get both of the evidence points. Okay, so definitely in the paragraph of your first answer, you have to provide relevant historical evidence. Okay, slavery, right, that's our first answer, existed in Africa, Asia, the Middle East, and other regions of the world throughout this period. That's evidence number 1, right? And you're not just simply stating facts that are already known. These are pieces of information that support the answer. So when I explain that slavery is a continuity during this time period as a labor system, I've explained that in a sense that it existed in several parts of the world throughout this period. So that explains slavery as a continuity. The trade of slaves in the Mediterranean and Black Sea areas by Islamic merchants also continued. Yet another piece of evidence. Talking about slavery, I've given you 2 different locations in the Eastern Hemisphere, the Mediterranean and Black Sea areas. With this trade network done by Islamic merchants. So there's another piece of evidence that supports slavery as a continuity. These slaves were sold to work on farm fields, to produce small-scale manufacturing products such as compasses or sextants for seafaring explorers, or as merchants in elite households. So these slaves that were traded across the Sahara and other parts of the Middle East, now I've explained what kind of work they did. Agriculture work, small-scale manufacturing, and I even gave some examples, and as servants in households. So there's 3 pieces of evidence for my first answer that support slavery as a continuity. Now, this world historical context, this is very important. This right here. You only need historical context for one answer. Or, how you're putting, whatever your theme or your connection is. You only need one historical evidence. What I've done in this essay is I've given you 4, and I did it for each one of my answers so you could see how it works. So I wanted to give you multiple examples, but remember, you only need one statement or, 2 sentences that explains the historical context for your answer, for your thesis. The trade in slaves for the Middle East involved a large system that captured non-Muslim peoples in parts of Southern Europe and in Northern Africa and brought them to the cities of the Middle East for a wide variety of purposes. So, by explaining, and up here in these first few sentences, right, I explained that slavery existed in other parts of the world during this time period. These are the people that ran the slave trade network in this part of the world. And it involved a system that captured non-Muslim peoples because it was operated by Islamic merchants, but captured non-Muslim peoples in parts of Southern Europe where the slavery didn't exist. They were just captured there, right? And other parts like Northern Africa and brought them to the cities of the Middle East. So there's your historical context. You've taken that answer and you've connected it to another part of the world, right? Because we've talked about it being a large system. Okay, so if you were to put historical evidence with this first answer, this is how you could do it. Okay? Answer 2. Alright, again, 3 pieces of evidence. Europeans who were looking for a large labor supply started a transatlantic slave trade. Now, this first sentence right here, Europeans who are looking for a large labor supply, that is not evidence. What I've done is I've transitioned into, from the first answer into my second answer, I've transitioned into giving evidence about the expansion of slavery into the Americas, into the New World. Because it's not counted as evidence because this is something that's already known. It's not necessarily supporting, right? Evidence is support. It doesn't necessarily support it. All right, 10 million Africans were shipped by the Middle Passage into the Caribbean and Latin America. Pieces of evidence. If you're off by, 1 million, because it's such a large number, that's okay. You would still get credit for it. So if you were to say 9 million or 11 million, that would be okay. But bringing up things like the Middle Passage, what this process was called, those are awesome points for an AP reader. And I've given location. Love that stuff. These slaves worked on plantations growing sugarcane and other cash crops like tobacco. Yet again, I have been specific by explaining sugarcane and other cash crops like tobacco. Every time you hear me tell you to be specific, that's what I'm talking about. Okay, don't just say that they worked on plantations growing cash crops. What kind of cash crops? In Africa, the slave trade transformed politics by creating powerful new elites who were linked to the traffic in slaves. Yet again, I have given you another piece of evidence explaining that the slave trade in Africa completely transformed the politics there. Okay? Alright. Historical context for this answer of the expansion of slavery into the New World. As Europeans continued to bring enslaved Africans to work on American plantations, right? I'm giving you this context of, a broader view here. New cultures and religions were created. Something like that is huge. Now you're making a connection, not just through different parts of the world, but because these cultures, like the Creole of southern North American colonies, or religions like Santeria, that blend African traditional religious practices with Christian aspects, because, why did that get there? I don't know. But because, I lost my place. But now we're not just linking different locations. I don't know why it's doing that. But now we are connecting time, because those cultures and that religion still exist in those locations today. So you've definitely made a huge connection if you could do something like that. Again, 3 pieces of evidence for the answer. Okay, your third answer. Again, I've got 3 pieces of evidence here for you, and this is the agriculture answer. Mainly through a process of elimination, Africans became the primary source of slave labor for the plantations of the Americas. During 1450 to 1750, the focus of agriculture, right, there's my answer, shifted from subsistence to cash crops, such as sugar, tobacco, and cotton. At the time, Africans were more familiar with large-scale farming than Native Americans and applied some of their African farming techniques. This is great evidence that shows the, I hate to say necessity, but what the Europeans felt as a necessity to bring slavery to the New World. They initially tried it with the Native Americans, but so many had died from diseases. Native Americans were not large-scale farmers like Africans were. The Africans were just very familiar with those techniques, and they were better for what the Europeans needed. So this section right here gives 3 pieces of evidence that explains agriculture and farming as an answer to a continuity for labor systems in the global system. Because even though the agriculture itself changed from subsistence to cash crops, the agriculture, which is your answer, still existed, right? Agriculture still exists today. It existed long before. Does that make sense? Hopefully you can understand that. I mean, I know you understand that agriculture existed before and it exists now. I know you understand that. What I'm asking is that you understand that that is a continuity in labor systems in the global system as opposed to a change, right? Despite the kind of, it doesn't matter what kind of agriculture they were doing, it was agriculture. Okay, farming. Okay. Here is the next example for relevant historical context for this answer. Again, you only need one historical context. You don't need it for each answer. Again, I've just given it for each answer so you can see several different examples. The production of sugar was truly the first global exchange network on a grand scale. Okay, right then and there, global exchange network, grand scale. What we've done is we've encompassed several different continents together and the creation of a whole new exchange network. Sugarcane was grown and processed into sugar and molasses in the Americas and shipped to Europe. Once in Europe, sugar could be further processed into other products and then sold. Europeans traded metal goods like firearms to transatlantic merchants. Traders took those same products to Africa and purchased more slaves, establishing the triangular trade. Bringing up something like the triangular trade and putting it into context, your answer of, small or agriculture, right? That and how necessary sugarcane. Well, I don't want to say necessary, but the demand that sugar had. I mean, Europeans, from the time that they colonized the Americas and began growing sugar in the Caribbean, the consumption of sugar by Europeans nearly quadrupled in about 100 years. How much they consumed, per person each year. It was in such high demand. Before, Europeans had sweetened their food with honey or different fruits, but with sugar, and that it could be processed into many different things. I mean, that opened the door to things like tea, and it's like the national beverage of England now, actually. So, I mean, not like, we all have a state song, not like that, but, I mean, to think out hot and warm tea, put in a lump of sugar, you think of Victorian England. And that's from the slave trade, and sugar, and how sugar really was like the first global exchange network, because we had sugar that was grown in the Americas, sometimes processed there, shipped to Europe, sold as it was, or even processed there. Then the Europeans could take their products that they made to Africa, and thus getting more slaves, taking those slaves to, across the Middle Passage to, grow more sugar. So, here's your historical context for the agriculture answer. And notice I'm sticking all within the same theme. I didn't just pick random different locations all over the place. That's not what, even though it was an open-ended question, I've got a connection working here with, slavery and agriculture within this time period. Okay, in the fourth answer that I gave you, an increased number of people began small-scale manufacturing. Here's your evidence for that answer. Before 1450, several Europeans worked the land as peasant farmers. However, many Europeans began to work at small-scale manufacturing after the age of exploration led to the development of new colonies around the world and exchange networks. So that right there, both support my answer, as an increasing number of people began to work in small-scale manufacturing. Right? Before 1450, this is what they did. However, they began to work in this way, right, manufacturing, because of the age of exploration and the development of new colonies around the world and the creation of new exchange networks. So there's how this labor system of, agriculture changed to small-scale manufacturing. Some people couldn't continue and maintain peasant farming. Now, and here's the rest of that. Africans even demanded trade items like firearms, gunpowder, alcohol, and textiles. And they demanded firearms and gunpowder from Europe, and some that were from the Americas, alcohol, especially rum that was made from the molasses, which is from sugar, and European and Indian textiles. And over time, shopkeepers hired more workers to maintain that demand. And here's your context for answer 4. Once Europeans established New World colonies, they purchased some trade items. Shells and Indian textiles, they actually used the shells for money in parts of West Africa. But Indian textiles with silver mined in the Americas. So, and this is a really good example of historical context, because now, we're taking this answer of more people becoming involved in small-scale manufacturing and, explaining that Europeans have established New World colonies, and in those colonies, right, they mined silver, and they had to purchase some of those trade items. They didn't manufacture all of them, right? They had to purchase some of them, like the shells and Indian textiles, and they did it with the silver mine in the Americas. So here is another great example of your world historical context. You've put it into a global view here. So therefore, the slave trade connected with commerce and silver and textiles as it became part of a materializing global network. So in 2 sentences, I've given my world historical context for the 4th answer. Okay, so hopefully now you understand. I've given my answer, and I've addressed all parts of the question in the first paragraph. I've dedicated a paragraph to each answer. And remember, you only need 1 historical context. You can do it in 2 sentences. Do it really, really well in 2 or 3 sentences. And you only need it for 1 of your answers. And I highly suggest that you put that context with whichever answer you choose to do it with. Don't just randomly put it somewhere just to have it. Okay, you do have to have some type of organization to your essay. Okay, now the analysis. Earlier I told you could put the analysis with each answer, and you can do that. By all means, each answer can have the evidence, the context, and the analysis. That's fine. But if you're able to explain each answer afterwards, that works too. And so here's where I explain the analysis on why the continuity or the change occurred. This is the big thing that I think all of us got confused about and what analysis really is. These are the hows and the whys. You are giving a reason. Think of analysis and reasoning. Analysis and reasoning. I analyze, I tell you why. I analyze, I tell you how. I analyze, I tell you cause and effect. That's analysis. Analysis and reason. So, here's the analysis for my 4 answers. Because Native Americans died of diseases so quickly after the Europeans enslaved them, African slaves became the largest factor in plantation agriculture. Boom. Slavery and the expansion of slavery in the New World. There it is. That's why. Because so many Native Americans died of diseases. They had to choose Africans to work in their plantations. During this time period, in every region of the world, people continued to work in agriculture. Therefore, slavery persevered as one of the world's main labor systems. There's slavery, there it is. Agriculture, there it is. Right? People continue to work in agriculture. Remember, that's already explained in answer 3. And explaining slavery persevered, which would also mean to continue, right, as one of the world's main labor systems. In addition, improved farming techniques had not yet increased productivity enough to allow a majority of people to leave farming. Now, that further explains the continuing of agriculture, but if you think about it, at the same time, it also explains an increasing number of people going into small-scale manufacturing, but not a large number, or the majority, right? It says the majority of people had to stay with farming. So that's how we explained just an increasing number of people, not everyone left the farm and ran to the city, right? When would that be? After 1750. So improved farming techniques had not yet increased productivity enough to allow a majority of people to leave farming. So there's your analysis. 3 sentences, and you could get your analysis points. Okay? Alright, the last paragraph, this is really expanded core area. I hope each and every one of you, and I expect each and every one of you, are shooting for that expanded core. Sophisticated discussion, this is what the expanded core is all about. A sophisticated discussion explaining a transformation, a specific cause and effect, or an argument, or it's showing a connection. And you really have to go beyond just the world historical context. Okay? Which is why I kind of emphasize the sophisticated part of explaining. Okay? And so here's a paragraph that does that. Remember, I had 4 answers. Okay? Yours isn't going to look like this, huge giant paragraph that no one should be afraid of. Slavery in the Americas differed in key ways from traditional slavery. Europeans dominated the Atlantic slave trade, which began during this time as a result of the European desire to participate in the Indian Ocean trade network, but did not take over large territories of Africa. Okay, so hopefully you can see what I'm trying to do here. I'm focusing on slavery and how it transformed, right? Transformation. And I'm also focusing on cause and effect, right? How, the cause of slavery in the Americas and how and who it was affected, or the effects of slavery. There we go. If I can get it out. It's late and I'm tired. Okay. The scale, right here. The scale of the transatlantic slave trade dwarfed earlier trade. Slaves were used mostly in plantation agriculture and were treated inhumanely. The children of slaves remained slaves, with little hope of obtaining freedom. And slavery in the Americas was distinctly racial. So hopefully you see what I'm doing here is I'm really focusing on, the different aspects of slavery that existed in the Americas. Most slaves destined for plantations in the Americas were males. However, traditional slave trading routes controlled by Muslims continued to transport mostly female slaves across the Sahara and into the Indian Ocean. Oddly enough, it was like 2-to-1 females with the Muslim-controlled slave trading routes, and then it was the opposite with the European-controlled trading routes to the Americas of 2-to-1 with males. But here's the effect of that. The transatlantic slave trade affected those African colonies. African societies. The gender imbalance led to an increase in polygamy, as well as a change in gender roles. Some African women were even able to gain approximate or some political power, because especially in those parts where African men had been captured and taken into sold into slavery because of the lack of men. There were just more women around. And they gained some administrative positions in politics within their societies. So here, what I've done is I've created a paragraph that explains how slavery transformed. I've given a cause. I've listed some effects. And I've even given an argument here about how it was different from traditional slavery. For example, back in the time of the ancient Romans, they just, especially during a time of expansion, would capture the local people, and it didn't matter, what their background was, what their ethnicity was, gender, it didn't matter. And some even volunteered into slavery to pay off debts. So it didn't matter the race, didn't matter the gender, didn't matter the reason. Just the more powerful became the master. But with slavery in the Americas, it was very different. And so I'm also giving you an argument. Okay, I know this was a long video. I thank you guys for sticking with me till the end. I really hope that this was helpful by giving you an example. Remember, mine was a lengthier essay because I gave a whole bunch of extra stuff that that you didn't necessarily have to have. I gave you 4 answers, and I provided historical context for each of those 4 answers. In your essay, even to get a 9 on your essay, you only need 1 world historical context. You only need it for 1 of your answers. So remember, 3 of my paragraphs could be cut in half, okay? But like I said, I hope that you found this helpful. Please, please, please take the time to go back over this if you need to. I don't want to say rewind. I'm showing my age there. But go back, pause, re-listen. Do what you need to do to make sure you understand this. I know each and every one of you are capable of coming up with a really awesome, knock your socks off essay. I know you can do it. You just have to make sure that you understand the question. That way you can develop those really good connections and explain your causes and your effects, right? Explain that argument and analyze. give reasons. Okay? All right. Hope this is helpful.